Chapter 4 of Tractate Gittin goes through additional laws on the bringing of the divorce document and points on its nullification when it's being brought by an agent. The first Mishnah says, if somebody sends a divorce document to his wife through an agent and he bumps into the agent before he delivers it, or he sends another agent to run and catch up to the first, he can tell him to make the divorce document void and it's been nullified. If the husband or his second agent reaches the wife first and tells her the divorce document that's going to arrive soon is void, it's nullified so long as it hasn't arrived yet. If it had, it's too late. Additionally, as the agent is traveling, the husband could convene a court elsewhere and nullify the divorce document where he is, although it was later decreed that this was not allowed as it could cause many issues. The Gemara says the wording implies that even if the husband bumps into the first agent by chance, he could nullify the divorce document without concern that he's just trying to annoy his wife throughout this whole process. The fact that he's allowed to send a second agent shows that his orders to the first agent do not override the orders of the second. Additionally, it taught the case where the husband reached his wife first to show, again, by here too, there's no concern that he did this to mess with his wife. It also shows that this is not a concern by him sending the second agent to his wife, even though he only did it through an agent. Further, it specified the husband can't nullify the document once it's actually reached the woman, to show that even if the husband is clearly rushing to try and annul it, but just doesn't get there in time, it nevertheless still would go through. It also discusses specific wording the husband should use to nullify the document. It works to say things like, the divorce document is void, or I do not want it, but to say things like the divorce document is invalid or it is not a divorce document, that does not work. These phrases are additionally qualified. Additional particular phraseology are discussed. If the husband cancelled the divorce document, it's debated if he can then later go and reactivate it. It's held that he can, although it is discussed. Prior to the annulment of the principle that the husband can just bring together a court to annul the document right where he is, it's debated if this court must consist of 2 or 3 people, as to if that's considered to be a legal court for this. They argue over sources as to the number of judges required in various circumstances. In regards to the prohibition of this practice of no longer allowing the annulment of a divorce document from far away with a personal court, this was done to prevent possible illegitimate children, as the wife wouldn't know that the divorce document she received was cancelled, and then she might impermissibly remarry. Others say the concern is the inverse, that wives who were divorced via agent won't remarry out of concern that their husband undid the divorce with his own court. The debate between these is as to whether the woman will find out about this via the information spreading, depending on whether this occurs if the annulment was done before 2 or 3 witnesses. After the institution of this, that it wasn't allowed, if the husband did nullify the document with his court anyways, it's debated if this now has any validity. Some say no, as the betrothal and divorce function through the sages, which means they can retroactively nullify the divorce, as even if the betrothal was done through cohabitation, they could just retroactively make it that their act of cohabitation was just a form of illicit relations, meaning they were never legally married in the first place. If a husband told 10 people to write a divorce document for his wife, some say he can nullify this before only one of them, others say that all 10 must be present. This disagreement is based on whether partially invalidated testimony is considered to be totally invalidated or not. Or possibly both opinions agree that partially invalidated testimony is not invalidated, and the disagreement is over whether something done before 10 people must be undone before all of them. There is a further question depending on which of these 2 issues you hold exists, as to if the husband said all of them should write the divorce document. It discusses this while comparing it to a number of related cases which are qualified. There are additional points. There's a quoted case where a man sent a divorce document to his wife, so the agent took it and brought it, but the wife said to give it to her the next day, so the agent went back, and the man said, "Thank God," essentially as he was happy it wasn't delivered. However, it's debated if him saying "thank God" was sufficient to nullify the document in regards to whether disclosure of intent is sufficient to nullify the document. They debate this from further sources. It brings a few particular cases to illustrate this principle. In conclusion, it says that we hold that a divorce document can be nullified before 2 people, along with this opinion's statements by the other arguments, and additionally that we hold with the opinion that disclosure of intent by a divorce document is just disregarded. New Mishnah. It was originally done that on the divorce document the husband would write the names which they were known by in the place that the document is written, along with their cities, but it was then instituted that they should write their names and any other names they're referred to by also to resolve any potential issues. The Gemara further describes this opinion with some instances, and that he writes all the names that he's known by with the name that they're primarily known by first. New Mishnah. A woman collects payment of her marriage contract through an oath if it's from orphan's property. Some courts wouldn't administer this oath, so it was said the woman should just accept any vow the orphans want her to take in regards to this and then collect the marriage contract. Anyways, the witnesses sign their names on the divorce document, even though it's not strictly necessary to prevent any issues. There was also a document established that prevented the sabbatical Shemitah year from repealing any outstanding debts to resolve potential issues. The Gemara says, The first point applies by general collection from orphans, but it specifically mentioned the widow to show we're not more lenient here to help her get remarried easier from these new assets. It cites cases which show why the courts don't force widows to take these oaths, one of which was a situation where a woman accidentally swore falsely during testimony about not having benefited from a gold coin when, unbeknownst to her, she actually had by mistakenly baking the coin into a loaf of bread. So because of the repercussions of this incident, they no longer required specifically widows to take oaths, not even when taking property from orphans who she takes care of. Some hold that you can nevertheless have her take an oath outside of court. It mentions related incidents. Some simply ruled to allow the widow, when collecting this property, to take a vow in court as the orphans require, as specified in the Mishnah, or to just take an oath outside of court. This all applies by a widow. By a divorcee, she can be made to swear. The point is debated. In regards to the opinion that the widow should take a vow as dictated by the orphan to collect their property, some hold this cannot be done if she already remarried. Others say she can, and the husband won't be able to revoke the vow as it will be made in public. This is discussed and there's a debate if, when annulling a vow, if the person needs to give the details of the circumstances around the taking of the vow. Some say no, as he might not give all the details. Some say yes, as the vow could have been taken in a forbidden manner, and the annuller should be informed of that if that was the case. This is further debated. It was said that witnesses sign their names on the document to prevent any issues. This is like the opinion that it's not typically required to have them sign the document, as the witnesses of the delivery are the ones who sever the marriage, and the other witnesses of the actual signing were just rabbinically instituted. Some sages would sign their names in such instances using a mark or symbol, like a fish or a sail, but that was publicly known about, so it was accepted. The points on the Shemitah sabbatical year not overriding lending documents is a principle known as prozbul, which was instituted. Essentially, as the Shemitah year annulled any of such documents, people wouldn't lend each other money as the year approached out of concern that they wouldn't be repaid. So the prozbul declaration essentially submits the debt to the court instead, which is not annulled within the coming of the Shemitah year, which is signed by witnesses, and they can then collect the money afterwards. This was instituted after the Shemitah year principle became one of rabbinic law only, which is why it was allowed. Alternatively, it functioned as the court is permitted to just declare property ownerless, which is sourced from some verses. There's some discussion on the point of prozbul along with points on etymology. There, for the points, it said that prozbul is only declared if the borrower has land to back his debt, and if he doesn't have any at all, the lender can give him ownership of a tiny piece of his land, which he doesn't even need to physically give over. Details of this principle are discussed along with additional discussion on the notion that the Shemitah sabbatical year cancels all withstanding debts. There are additional points on these laws. New Mishnah. If a Jewish person's Canaanite slave was taken captive and other Jewish people ransomed him, if they ransomed him as a slave, then he's a slave. If they ransomed him as a free man, then he's free. Others say he's always ransomed as a slave. The Gemara explains that this is prior to where the owner abandoned the slave. And if he was ransomed as a free man, he would still not be enslaved according to the first opinion, as they hold that the first man's ownership was revoked. So that way people will be more likely to ransom slaves. The other opinion disagrees, saying there's a mitzvah to ransom slaves. Others hold the opposite, saying this case was after the first owner abandoned him, so he's either enslaved again by the second man or not, and the other opinion disagrees to prevent the potential likelihood of slaves getting themselves up to bandits to be able to escape. These opinions are debated on further. There's further discussion. Some hold that if such a slave is captured and he then escapes on his own, he's considered to be emancipated, and the master must write him a emancipation document. There are additional points along with a few particular cases brought. There's more of this. Some say it's actually a transgression to free a Canaanite slave. Others disagree. It's debated. It said if a slave is consecrated to the temple, he goes free, as it can't be the man himself, and it wasn't the value of the man either. So it's interpreted to mean that he's saying he should become like a person who's consecrated, like a free Jew. It's also said if you declare the slave ownerless, he's free. There's additional points on these laws. The points and principles of the consecration of a slave and its legal validity is debated further, along with declaring a slave to be ownerless as to whether he additionally requires a document of emancipation. There's further points, and it describes which laws by this we hold. Like, there's additional discussion on certain actions a slave can do that, if done, causes us to presume he was freed. For instance, borrowing money from the owner, being the administrator of his property, wearing tefillin, and others, along with debate if a person can make his heirs emancipate his slaves after his death. There are additional points, along with a few particular instances. There are further laws on the emancipation of a slave. New Mishnah. If somebody designated a slave as collateral and then emancipated him to resolve potential issues, the owner must have the slave go free, and it's debated who writes the note of indebtedness, either the slave or the emancipator. The Gemara goes through this case and clarifies points. It's the first owner who's emancipating the man, and the slave is not obligated at all to work for the second, but to prevent issues, the second man frees him anyways. The remaining points in the case are discussed along the points on using property as collateral, such as if the designated property is flooded. There's debate if the creditor can collect from other properties, along with additional points. New Mishnah. Somebody who's half slave and half free. Beis Hillel says he works 1 day for his owner and 1 day for himself. Beis Shammai says there's an issue as to how he can marry, so he says that the owner must free him in exchange for half the slave's value, and Beis Hillel changed his ruling to agree with Beis Shammai. The Gemara states additional discussion on these principles. There are additional laws and points about the concept of half-freed slaves. There's more, and then how he or his half-owner are repaid if he's killed by somebody's ox or otherwise injured, and if a freed slave's owner is a Kohen, if he hasn't yet been emancipated with a document as to whether he can still eat truma. There are further additional points on all these laws, and additionally regarding betrothal of a half-slave and similar. There are additional points. New Mishnah. If a person sells a slave to a non-Jewish person or to somebody who lives outside of Israel, the slave is automatically freed. The Gemara says an opinion that by the first case, he should write a document which says he does not retain ownership if the slave escapes. This goes further. There's additional discussion and debate if selling a slave to a Kuthian or apostate has a similar status to selling it to a non-Jewish person. If non-Jewish bandits captured a person's slave, it's argued if he can be paid for the slave by the bandits, as this would typically not be a permitted sale. Additionally, if a person does sell a slave to a non-Jewish person, which is ruled to not be allowed, as the slave won't be then keeping Torah and mitzvahs in such a situation, so he must buy him back for whatever the price. Some say there's a less severe penalty here, as this is uncommon. There's additional points on this and on the prohibition to sell a slave to a person who lives outside of Israel. It's explained that in such a situation, the purchaser is penalized, along with some related incidents and expansion on some particular verses. New Mishnah. Captives cannot be ransomed for more than their value to prevent any further potential issues. Additionally, it's forbidden to help captives escape, which is explained to be to prevent any future or remaining captives from being mistreated further. The Gemara further describes these points along with a few particular incidents. There's a story where a sage saw that the daughters of another sage would stir a boiling pot with their hands without being harmed, so he assumed that they were very righteous. Once all three of them were captured, and a raven and then a dove spoke to the sage telling him to flee. So he went to check on the other daughters, and he overheard them saying that they were marrying their captors, so he escaped on his own, and when the two daughters eventually returned, he found out that they had been stirring the pot with sorcery. New Mishnah. You cannot buy Torah scrolls, tefillin, or mezuzahs from non-Jewish people for more than their value to prevent any potential issues of theft and ransoming of such scrolls. The Gemara discusses these points and mentions that a Torah scroll written by an idol-worshipping priest should be burnt, and if by a non-Jewish person, it should just be stored away. And if it was found in the possession of an idolatrous priest, it should be put away. And if it was by a non-Jewish person, some say it couldn't be read from. It cites related points on this topic and says you can pay up to a Tractate coin above their value, but also not to undervalue them either, as the sage did this once. And the seller who was selling a pair of tefillin got upset and angrily threw the tefillin into a river. New Mishnah. If somebody divorces his wife due to her poor reputation or due to a vow, he can't remarry her. Some say he can if it was a private vow. Some say it's allowed if it was a vow that does not require asking a sage. Some disagree. And there's a case where a man vowed against benefiting from anything unless he divorced her, and he was allowed to remarry her to prevent potential issues. The Gemara further describes these cases and the different methods and principles of these vows. It debates if a public vow is before 3 or 10 people, which is based on verses along with the remaining points. The last case is also qualified. It debates if the point on preventing potential issues applies to the first case or to the last. New Mishnah. If somebody divorces his wife because he found out that she was an Ilonis, a physically unique woman with male characteristics, it's debated if he's allowed to remarry her. If she remarries and has children and demands her Kosovo marriage contract payment from the first husband, he can tell her it would be better to not require this, as he can retroactively cancel his divorce based on this new information and therefore make her children illegitimate. The Gemara discusses these points. New Mishnah. If somebody sells himself and his children as slaves to a non-Jewish person, they're not redeemed, but we do redeem the children after the father passes. The Gemara says an opinion that this rule only applies if he's done this multiple times. Related incidents are cited. There is a related story where the sage Reish Lakish, who was a bandit chief when he was younger, allowed himself to be captured by a cannibal tribe and brought a bag and a hard stone ball. On the day he was to be killed, they told him that they had a tradition that he would be granted one final request to the man that they'd be eating to gain forgiveness. So he said that he wanted to tie them all to chairs and hit them with his bag. So they agreed, and then he put the stone in the bag, and then he beat them all to death with it. Anyways, he eventually became a great sage from a later story and lived a very simple lifestyle. New Mishnah. If somebody sells his field to a non-Jewish person, he must purchase and bring the first fruit tithes of the field from him to prevent potential issues. The Gemara explains the sale of such land does not reduce the sanctity of the land, and the non-Jewish person acquires it fully. Others disagree with this point, and it's debated based on the interpretation of a verse. It discusses how there's no reduction in sanctity after such a sale in regards to collecting tithes. There's further discussion on this and variation in regards to the property that's in Syria, which has a slightly different status. Further, the requirement to bring the first fruit tithes from such a sale is said by some to be to prevent potential issues, not as a biblical requirement. If a person sells the rice to the produce of his field, but retains the field itself, it debates if the buyer needs to separate the first fruits with a blessing or not, as he doesn't actually own the field. This debate is based on whether a person who purchases an item for its produce, whether that's considered to be an acquisition of the item itself or not. It debates this principle from several sources. There's additional discussion on this, the Shemitah sabbatical year, and on the Yovel year, and this goes further. And that's the end of chapter 4.